My name is Natalie Brooks, and as I sit here in my home office overlooking the Seattle skyline, watching the morning fog roll over Elliott Bay, I can't help but laugh at the irony of my current situation. Just yesterday, I received a call that would change everything. A call that would finally silence the years of mockery, doubt, and outright sabotage from the person who should have supported me most. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Right now, I'm dealing with what I call the entrepreneur's dilemma, having more money than I ever dreamed possible, yet still finding myself eating cereal for dinner because I'm too exhausted from back-to-back investor meetings to cook a proper meal. Success, I've learned, doesn't automatically solve all your problems. It just gives you different, more expensive ones. Like figuring out which of your 3 financial advisors is giving you the best advice on tax optimization, or wondering if that person who suddenly wants to reconnect after 10 years of silence is genuinely interested in your well-being or your bank account. The truth is, building a $500 million company from scratch changes you in ways you never expect. It's not just about the money, though I won't lie and say that part isn't incredible. It's about discovering who really believes in you when you have nothing but a dream and a laptop, versus who shows up when Forbes puts your face on their cover. Today, I want to share with you a story that began 5 years ago when I was 28 years old and living in a studio apartment in Capitol Hill that was so small I could touch both walls if I stretched my arms out wide. I was working 18-hour days on what everyone, and I mean everyone, told me was a foolish venture destined for failure. My bank account had exactly $342, I was living on ramen noodles and determination, and my family thought I had completely lost my mind. See, I had this crazy idea about revolutionizing how small businesses handle their digital infrastructure. While everyone else was focused on creating the next social media app or dating platform, I saw a massive gap in the market. Small business owners were drowning in outdated systems, paying thousands of dollars for clunky software that barely worked, and spending more time fighting their technology than actually running their companies. I knew there had to be a better way. My background was in software engineering, but I'd spent 3 years working at a consulting firm where I watched brilliant business owners struggle with the same problems over and over again. They'd hire expensive IT consultants who would install systems that were either too complicated to use or too limited to be effective. I saw restaurant owners manually entering data that should have been automated, retail stores losing sales because their payment systems crashed during peak hours, and service companies buried under paperwork that could have been digitized and streamlined. The solution seemed obvious to me: create an all-in-one platform that would be powerful enough for complex operations, but simple enough that any business owner could master it in a weekend. I wanted to build something that would grow with a company from startup to enterprise level, without requiring them to constantly switch platforms or lose their data. It would handle everything from inventory management and customer relations, to financial reporting and employee scheduling, all integrated seamlessly and priced affordably. But having a brilliant idea and actually executing it are 2 completely different challenges. I spent every waking moment coding, designing user interfaces, testing functionality, and reaching out to potential customers for feedback. My social life disappeared entirely. I turned down job offers from major tech companies that would have tripled my salary because I believed in what I was building. I maxed out credit cards, borrowed money from friends, and sold everything I owned that wasn't absolutely essential. The worst part wasn't the financial stress or the endless work, it was the constant doubt from people who were supposed to support me. Whenever I tried to explain my vision to friends, I could see their eyes glaze over. They'd nod politely and change the subject, or worse, they'd give me that patronizing smile that said they thought I was chasing an impossible dream. Former colleagues would run into me at coffee shops and ask when I was going to get back to real work, as if what I was doing was just an expensive hobby. But no one was more skeptical than my own family, especially my older sister Vanessa. At 31, she had what everyone considered a stable, respectable career as a mid-level marketing manager at a regional insurance company in our hometown of Cedar Falls, Oregon. She'd been there for 8 years, had worked her way up from entry level, and earned a comfortable salary that allowed her to buy a nice house in a good neighborhood and take 2 vacations a year. Vanessa had always been the practical one, the sister who colored inside the lines and followed conventional wisdom. When we were growing up, I was the one who took apart electronics to see how they worked, while she studied for tests weeks in advance, and kept detailed planners with color-coded schedules. Our parents always praised her responsibility and organization, holding her up as an example for me to follow. When I first told my family about leaving my stable job to start my own company, Vanessa was the most vocal opponent of the decision. During our monthly family dinner at my parents' house, a tradition that continued even after we'd both moved out, she spent an entire evening listing all the reasons my plan would fail. She had statistics about startup failure rates, horror stories about entrepreneurs who'd lost everything, and a PowerPoint presentation she'd apparently prepared in advance about the importance of financial security. "Natalie, I'm saying this because I love you," she said, gesturing with her fork for emphasis while our parents nodded along. 90% of startups fail within the first year. The ones that do survive usually take 3 to 5 years to become profitable if they ever do at all. You're throwing away a guaranteed income and career progression for what? A pipe dream? I tried to explain my market research, the feedback I'd gotten from potential customers, the competitive analysis I'd done, but every point I made was met with another objection. When I mentioned that several small business owners had already expressed interest in beta testing my platform, Vanessa dismissed it as people being polite. When I talked about the potential market size, she said I was being unrealistic about market penetration. When I showed them the prototype I'd built, she pointed out bugs and missing features instead of acknowledging the functionality that was already working. The criticism might have been easier to take if it came from a place of genuine concern, but there was something else in Vanessa's tone, something that felt almost gleeful about predicting my failure. It was as if she needed me to fail in order to validate her own choice. Her safe, conventional path would look less appealing if her younger sister succeeded at something risky and unconventional. Our parents, Robert and Patricia Brooks, fell somewhere in the middle. Dad had worked for 30 years as an accountant for the city government, climbing slowly but steadily to become the head of the municipal finance department. Mom had been a high school English teacher for most of her career before retiring early to take care of our grandmother. They were good people who'd provided a stable, loving home, but they'd never taken any major risks in their lives. The concept of voluntarily leaving a good job to chase an uncertain dream was completely foreign to them. "We just want to make sure you're being realistic, sweetheart," Mom would say whenever I updated them on my progress. "It's wonderful that you're ambitious, but maybe you could work on this as a side project while keeping your day job. That way you'd have a safety net if things don't work out." Dad's concerns were more practical. "Have you thought about health insurance? Retirement savings? What happens if you get sick and can't work for a few months? At least at your old job, you had benefits and paid time off." I understood their worries, and part of me appreciated that they came from a place of love. But it was frustrating to feel like I had to constantly defend my decision instead of receiving encouragement. Every family gathering became an interrogation about my finances, my timeline, my backup plans. Vanessa would ask pointed questions designed to highlight the weaknesses in my strategy, while my parents would exchange worried glances that made me feel like I was disappointing them. The dynamic became even more strained as months passed, and I was still working 18-hour days with little to show for it except a growing pile of credit card debt and an increasingly sophisticated prototype that no one seemed to understand or value. Vanessa started making comments about my appearance, how tired I looked, how I'd lost weight, how I seemed stressed all the time. She'd suggest job openings she'd heard about, sending me links to positions that paid well but would have required me to abandon everything I'd been building. I saw that Microsoft is hiring senior developers, she'd mention casually during phone calls. "The starting salary is probably twice what you were making at your old job, plus they have amazing benefits and work-life balance. You could probably still work on your little project in your spare time." The phrase "little project" became her standard way of referring to my company, always delivered with a slight emphasis that made it clear she didn't consider it a real business. When I tried to correct her, explaining the complexity of what I was building or the potential impact it could have, she'd nod patronizingly and change the subject. Things reached a breaking point during Thanksgiving of my first year as an entrepreneur. The whole extended family was gathered at my parents' house: aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends who'd been coming to our holiday celebrations for years. It should have been a time of gratitude and togetherness, but it turned into a public humiliation that I still remember with crystal clarity. I was helping in the kitchen when my Aunt Linda asked how my business venture was going. Before I could answer, Vanessa jumped in with what she probably thought was helpful context. "Oh, Natalie's still playing entrepreneur," she said with a laugh that was just a little too sharp to be entirely affectionate. "She quit her job almost a year ago to build some kind of software thing. We keep telling her to get back into the real world, but you know how stubborn she can be." The conversation that followed was excruciating. Multiple family members offered advice about getting back on track and learning from this experience. My uncle Mike, who owned a small auto repair shop, listened politely while I tried to explain how my platform could help businesses like his, then patted me on the shoulder and said, "That sounds real complicated, kiddo. I think I'll stick with my old-fashioned way of doing things." My cousin Jennifer, who worked in HR for a large corporation, spent 10 minutes lecturing me about the importance of steady employment and building a retirement fund. "You're still young enough to recover from this," she said as if I was recovering from a serious illness. "But don't wait too long. The longer you're out of the traditional workforce, the harder it becomes to get back in." But it was Vanessa's final comment that cut the deepest. As the evening was winding down and people were starting to leave, she cornered me in the hallway outside the kitchen. "I hope you know I'm only saying this because I care about you," she said, lowering her voice in a way that somehow made her words more hurtful. "But this whole thing is getting embarrassing. You're 30 years old, living like a college student, talking about your company like it's some major corporation when it's just you in a tiny apartment. People are starting to talk and not in a good way." I stared at her, feeling a mixture of hurt and rage that made it hard to speak. "What people? What are they saying? They're worried about you. We all are. You used to be so grounded, so practical. Now you're chasing this fantasy that's obviously never going to work out. Look at yourself, Natalie. When's the last time you bought new clothes? Or went on or did anything that normal people your age do? You're throwing your life away for something that exists only in your head." The words hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to argue, to defend myself.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
To explain everything she was missing about what I was building and why it mattered. But standing there in my parents' hallway, surrounded by the sounds of family members saying their goodbyes and making plans for Christmas, I suddenly felt completely alone. That night I drove back to Seattle in silence, replaying the conversation over and over in my mind. Was I deluding myself about the potential of what I was building? Had I become so invested in the idea that I couldn't see it objectively anymore? When I got back to my tiny apartment, I sat at my computer and looked at months of work, thousands of lines of code, detailed user interface designs, market research, financial projections, beta testing feedback from the handful of small business owners who were willing to try my platform. For the first time since I'd started this journey, I seriously considered giving up, but something inside me refused to quit. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was genuine belief in what I was creating. The next morning I got up and went back to work. I had a breakthrough in solving a complex integration problem that had been frustrating me for weeks. A few days later, one of my beta testers called to tell me that my platform had helped them identify and fix an inventory management issue that had been costing them thousands of dollars a month. Small victories like that kept me going through the darkest months of building my company. Every time doubt crept in, usually after another family gathering where Vanessa would make subtle comments about my phase or my parents would ask if I'd given any more thought to more traditional options, I'd remember the excitement in a customer's voice when they realized how much time and money my software could save them. The irony was that the more progress I made, the less my family seemed to believe in what I was doing. By the end of my second year, I had 50 paying customers, a small but growing team of contractors, and revenue that was increasing every month. But when I shared these milestones during family calls, the response was always lukewarm. "That's nice, honey," Mom would say in the same tone she might use to congratulate a child on a good report card. "Just make sure you're not getting in over your head." Vanessa's skepticism became even more pronounced as my success became harder to ignore. When I mentioned hiring my first full-time employee, she asked how I could afford to pay someone else when I was barely making ends meet myself. When I told them about moving to a larger office space, she wondered aloud if I was getting ahead of myself and taking on unnecessary expense. The breaking point came during Christmas dinner of my third year. I had just closed a major deal with a regional restaurant chain that wanted to implement my platform across all their locations. It was the kind of contract that would triple my annual revenue and validate everything I'd been working toward. I was excited to share the news with my family, thinking that surely this would convince them that I was building something real and valuable. Instead, Vanessa's reaction was swift and cutting. "How much is this contract actually worth?" she asked, her tone suggesting she expected me to either exaggerate or avoid giving specific numbers. When I told her the figure, a mid-six-figure deal spread over 2 years, she laughed out loud. "Natalie, that's not real money. I mean, it sounds impressive, but you have to pay your employees, your office rent, your software licenses, taxes, insurance. By the time you factor in all your expenses, you're probably making less than I do at my job, and I get benefits and job security." The dismissal stung, but what hurt more was that she was doing it in front of our entire family. Cousins who had been genuinely interested in hearing about my success suddenly looked uncertain, as if Vanessa's skepticism was more credible than my actual achievement. Plus, she continued, clearly warming to her theme, "One contract doesn't make a company. What happens when this deal ends? What happens if they decide they don't like your software and want to cancel early? You're building your whole future on something that could disappear tomorrow. I tried to explain that this wasn't my only client, that I had dozens of other customers and a growing pipeline of prospects. But Vanessa had an answer for everything. My customer base was too small to be sustainable. My pricing model was probably unsustainable. My growth projections were unrealistic. For every piece of good news I shared, she had a reason why it wasn't as impressive as it seemed. The most frustrating part was that our parents just sat there, nodding along as if Vanessa was the voice of reason and I was a naive child, who needed to be brought back down to earth. When I finally snapped and asked why they couldn't just be happy for me, Dad gave me a patronizing smile. "We are happy for you, sweetheart. We just don't want you to get your hopes up too high. Vanessa has experience in the business world, and she's only trying to help you see things realistically." That was the moment I realized that no amount of success would ever be enough to change their mind. In their eyes, I would always be the impractical dreamer, while Vanessa would always be the responsible one with valuable insights about how the real world worked. I decided that night to stop sharing details about my business with my family. It was too painful to have every achievement questioned, every milestone dismissed, every bit of progress minimized. Instead, I focused on building relationships with mentors, other entrepreneurs and industry contacts who understood what I was trying to accomplish. The decision to cut my family out of my professional life was both liberating and lonely. On one hand, I no longer had to brace myself for skepticism and criticism every time I wanted to celebrate a win. On the other hand, I was missing the support system that most people take for granted. When I signed my 100th customer, when I was featured in a trade publication, when I hired my 10th employee, I had no one to call who would truly understand the significance of these milestones. But the business kept growing. By my 4th year, Pinnacle Digital Solutions had become exactly what I'd envisioned, a comprehensive platform that was transforming how small and medium businesses operated. We had customers in 43 states, and were processing millions of dollars in transactions every month. I'd raised funding from investors, built a team of incredibly talented people, and established partnerships with major software companies who wanted to integrate with our platform. The success was intoxicating, but it was also isolating. The bigger my company grew, the wider the gap became between my reality and what my family understood about my life. During our monthly phone calls, I'd share generic updates about being busy with work while carefully avoiding any details that might prompt Vanessa's analysis or my parents' worried questions about financial stability. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued to treat my business as an elaborate hobby. She'd ask about it in the same tone she might inquire about a book I was reading or a TV show I was watching, politely interested but not expecting anything too significant. When I mentioned traveling for business conferences, she assumed I meant local networking events. When I talked about hiring decisions, she thought I meant bringing on freelancers or part-time help. The disconnect became almost surreal. I was living in a beautiful house in Bellevue, driving a Tesla, wearing custom-tailored suits to board meetings, and managing a company that was on track to generate 8-figure annual revenue. But in my family's perception, I was still the struggling entrepreneur who'd made a questionable decision to leave steady employment. Part of me wanted to correct their misconceptions, to show them exactly how wrong they'd been about my prospects and my capabilities. But another part of me had moved beyond needing their validation. I'd built something incredible with the support of people who believed in my vision from the beginning. The opinions of people who'd never believed in me seemed less and less relevant as my success became undeniable to everyone except them. Still, there were moments when the family dynamic felt like an open wound that hadn't healed properly. During holidays or special occasions, when I was surrounded by relatives who still saw me as the impractical dreamer who'd never quite figured out how to be an adult, I felt the sharp contrast between their perception and my reality. It was particularly difficult when Vanessa would give me career advice, speaking from her position as someone who'd made smart choices about financial security. She'd recommend job openings she'd heard about, suggest that I consider going back to school for an MBA to round out my business knowledge, or offer to introduce me to people in her network who might be able to help me find more stable opportunities. These conversations were exercises in self-control. I wanted to tell her about the acquisition offers I was fielding from Fortune 500 companies, the board meetings where we discussed expansion into international markets, the investors who were eager to fund our next phase of growth. Instead, I'd thank her for thinking of me and change the subject. The restraint was getting harder to maintain as my company's success became more public. Trade publications wrote articles about our innovative approach to small business software. Industry conferences invited me to speak about entrepreneurship and technology trends. Other business owners started reaching out for advice about building and scaling their own companies. But somehow, none of this filtered back to my family. Cedar Falls, Oregon, might as well have been on a different planet from the Seattle tech scene. My parents didn't read the business journals that featured my company. Vanessa didn't move in circles where people discussed emerging software platforms or startup success stories. Their ignorance of my actual circumstances became both a blessing and a source of frustration. I didn't have to deal with requests for money or investment opportunities, which I'd seen tear apart other successful entrepreneurs' relationships with their family. But I also couldn't share the excitement of building something extraordinary with the people who'd known me longest. The isolation was about to end in the most dramatic way possible. What I didn't know was that my success had finally attracted the attention of people whose job it was to verify exactly how much money I was making. The IRS had questions about my tax returns, questions that would soon lead to a conversation that would change everything about how my family saw me and my little project. But that part of the story, the part that would finally silence every doubt, every criticism, every patronizing comment about my impractical dreams, was still a few months away. For now, I was content to let them think whatever they wanted while I focused on building something that would speak louder than any argument I could make. The turning point came during what should have been one of the proudest moments of my entrepreneurial journey. It was late March and I had just received confirmation that Pinnacle Digital Solutions had been selected as one of the fastest growing companies in the Pacific Northwest by Seattle Business Magazine. The recognition came with a feature article, a photo shoot, and an invitation to speak at their annual entrepreneurship summit. More importantly, the article included details about our revenue growth, our client base, and our expansion plans that painted a very different picture from the struggling startup my family imagined. The journalist had done thorough research, interviewing several of our major clients and getting quotes from industry analysts about our market position. It was the kind of external validation that I'd been hoping would finally make my family understand what I'd actually built. I debated whether to share the article with them. Part of me wanted to let the success speak for itself, to watch their reactions when they realized how dramatically they'd underestimated what I was doing. But another part of me still craved their approval, still wanted them to be proud of what I'd accomplished despite their years of skepticism. I decided to send the link to my parents and Vanessa with a simple message about being featured in the magazine. The responses I got back were exactly what I should have expected, but somehow still managed to disappoint me. Mom replied first with a message that said, "That's wonderful, honey. I'm so proud that you're getting some recognition for all your hard work. Maybe this will help you get more clients." Her response was sweet and well-intentioned, but it completely missed the significance of what the article revealed about the company's actual size and success. Dad's response was similarly off-target. "Congratulations on the magazine feature. That kind of publicity should be good for business. Just make sure you're not spending too much on marketing expenses." He was still thinking about my company as a small operation that needed to watch every penny, not understanding that we were past the point of worrying about basic overhead costs. But it was Vanessa's response that really stung. She waited 3 days to reply, and when she did, her message was a masterclass in backhanded commentary disguised as sisterly concern. "I saw the article, and it's great that you're getting some media attention. I have to say though, some of those growth projections seem pretty optimistic. I work with marketing teams all the time, and I know how these business magazines love to exaggerate success stories to make them more exciting for readers. I hope you're not believing your own hype too much. Remember, sustainable growth is more important than flashy headlines." She then spent 2 paragraphs explaining how media coverage could create unrealistic expectations and pressure that might actually hurt a small business in the long run. She recommended that I stay grounded and not let the attention go to my head. She ended by suggesting that I might want to consult with an experienced business advisor who could help me separate the publicity from the actual financial reality of my situation. Reading her response felt like being slapped in the face. Here was concrete, third-party validation of everything I'd been trying to tell them for years, and she was still finding ways to diminish it. The article had included specific revenue figures, client testimonials, and industry expert analysis that made it clear Pinnacle Digital Solutions was a legitimate, successful company. But Vanessa was determined to interpret it as inflated marketing copy rather than factual report. What made it even more frustrating was that I knew she was smart enough to understand what the article actually said. She worked in marketing, she understood business metrics, and she was perfectly capable of reading between the lines of a well-researched piece of journalism. Her response wasn't based on misunderstanding, it was based on a willful refusal to accept that her little sister had succeeded at something she'd predicted would fail. That was the moment I realized that no amount of external validation would ever change their perception of me or my business. They had invested too much in the narrative of me as the impractical dreamer who needed to be brought back down to earth. Admitting that I'd been right all along would mean acknowledging that they'd been wrong for years, and that was apparently too difficult for them to accept. I stopped sharing business updates with my family entirely after that. When they asked how work was going during our monthly phone calls, I gave generic answers about being busy and working on new projects. When they invited me to family gatherings, I often declined, citing work commitments that they probably assumed were exaggerated attempts to sound important. The distance I created was both protective and painful. I was shielding myself from their constant skepticism and minimization, but I was also missing out on the family connections that had once been important to me. Holidays became particularly difficult, as I found myself choosing between subjecting myself to more criticism or spending important occasions alone. Meanwhile, my professional life was reaching new heights of success. We'd expanded into 3 new market segments, opened offices in Portland and San Francisco, and established partnerships with several Fortune 500 companies who wanted to integrate our platform with their existing system. I was invited to join the boards of 2 industry organizations and was frequently quoted in trade publications as an expert on small business technology trends. The financial success was beyond anything I'd imagined when I started the company. My personal income had grown exponentially, and the company's valuation had reached levels that put us in conversations with major investment firms and potential acquirers. I was living a life that would have seemed impossible during those early days of ramen noodles and maxed-out credit cards. But the isolation from my family cast a shadow over even the biggest victory. When we signed our 1,000th customer, when I was invited to speak at a major industry conference, when we received our first acquisition offer, I had no one to call who would understand the full significance of these milestones. I tried to fill that gap by building stronger relationships with other entrepreneurs and industry mentors. I joined several professional organizations and started attending networking events where I could connect with people who understood the challenges and rewards of building a company from scratch. These relationships were valuable and fulfilling, but they couldn't completely replace the family support I'd been craving for years. The situation with my family reached a new level of absurdity during my cousin Jennifer's wedding the following summer. I had initially planned to skip the event, but my mother called and practically begged me to attend, saying it would mean so much to the family to have me there. Against my better judgment, I decided to go, thinking that maybe enough time had passed for the dynamics to have shifted. The wedding was held at a beautiful vineyard in the Willamette Valley about an hour south of Portland. It was the kind of elegant, expensive celebration that suggested Jennifer and her fiancé were doing quite well financially. I arrived wearing a designer dress that had cost more than most people spend on their monthly rent, driving the Tesla that I'd bought myself as a reward for hitting our first major revenue milestone. The reactions from my extended family were a mixture of surprise and confusion. Several relatives commented on how successful I looked, but their tone suggested they weren't quite sure what to make of my apparent prosperity. My Aunt Linda asked if I was dating someone wealthy, apparently unable to imagine that I might be generating this level of income myself. Vanessa's response was predictable. She complimented my dress but immediately followed it with a comment about how I must be doing well enough to splurge on nice things occasionally. When relatives asked about my business, she would jump in with explanations about how entrepreneurship was feast or famine, and how successful entrepreneurs often invested heavily in their appearance to maintain credibility with clients. You have to look the part when you're trying to convince people to trust you with their business systems, she said, as if my success was purely a matter of good marketing rather than actual results. Image is everything in the startup world. The most painful moment came during the reception dinner, when my Uncle Mike stood up to give a toast about family success stories. He mentioned several relatives who had achieved various milestones, promotions, graduations, new babies, home purchase. When he got to me, he smiled warmly and said, "And we're so proud of Natalie for following her dreams and building her little technology company. It takes real courage to strike out on your own, even if it doesn't always work out the way you hope." The phrasing made it sound like I was still in the experimental phase of my entrepreneurial journey, still trying to figure out if my little technology company would ever become viable. I wanted to stand up and correct him, to explain that Pinnacle Digital Solutions had processed over $50 million in transactions the previous quarter alone. Instead, I smiled and nodded, feeling like a fraud for not defending my own accomplishment. Later that evening, as the reception was winding down, I found myself in conversation with Jennifer's new husband, who worked in finance for a regional bank. He was asking polite questions about my business when Vanessa joined the conversation. "Natalie's built this software platform for small businesses," she explained, adopting the tone of someone helping to translate a complex topic for general consumption. "It's been a really interesting learning experience for her, getting to see how challenging it is to scale a technology company. She's discovered that there's a huge difference between having a good idea and actually building a sustainable business around it. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, but what frustrated me most was that she was actively undermining my credibility in front of someone who might actually understand the significance of what I'd built. Jennifer's husband worked in commercial banking. He dealt with successful small and medium businesses every day. He would have been perfectly capable of appreciating the scope and impact of Pinnacle Digital Solutions if he'd been given accurate information. Instead, thanks to Vanessa's helpful explanation, he probably walked away thinking I was a well-meaning amateur who was slowly learning that entrepreneurship was harder than she'd expected. I could see it in his expression as the conversation progressed, the polite interest of someone who was trying to be encouraging to someone pursuing a difficult dream. That night, driving back to Seattle, I made a decision that felt both liberating and fine. I was done trying to convince my family of anything. I was done sharing my successes and hoping for recognition that would never come. I was done subjecting myself to their skepticism and allowing their limited perspective to diminish my accomplishment. From that point forward, I treated family gatherings like social obligations rather than opportunities for genuine connection. I attended when absolutely necessary, stayed for the minimum acceptable amount of time, and shared nothing meaningful about my professional life. When relatives asked about work, I gave vague answers about being busy and changed the subject as quickly as possible. The strategy worked in terms of protecting my emotional well-being, but it also meant that I was essentially living a double life. My family knew me as someone who was still struggling to make her entrepreneurial dreams work, while my professional colleagues knew me as the founder of one of the fastest-growing companies in the region. The disconnect became even more pronounced as Pinnacle Digital Solutions continued to expand. We acquired 2 smaller competitors, launched operations in Canada and the UK, and signed partnerships with major technology companies that most people would recognize. I was invited to speak at international conferences, consulted with government agencies about small business policy, and was featured on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine. But none of this filtered back to my family's awareness. They lived in a different world, one where business success was measured by traditional metrics like steady employment, predictable paychecks, and conventional career progression. The tech industry's rapid growth cycles and exponential scaling opportunities were foreign concepts that didn't fit into their framework for understanding professional achievement. I began to wonder if they would ever recognize what I'd accomplished, or if their perception of me was permanently fixed. Maybe Vanessa would always see me as the little sister who'd made an impractical choice that had somehow worked out better than expected. Maybe my parents would always worry about my financial stability, no matter how much evidence they received to the contrary. The thought was both depressing and strangely freeing. If their opinion was never going to change, then I could stop caring about it. I could focus on building the company, serving our customers, and enjoying the success I'd created without constantly seeking validation from people who were determined not to give it. Little did I know that the universe was about to provide validation in a way that would be impossible for anyone to dismiss or minimize. The call that would change everything was still months away, but the seeds were being planted by accountants and auditors who were very interested in understanding exactly how much money Pinnacle Digital Solutions was generating and where all of it was going. The IRS, as it turned out, had a very different perspective on my little technology company than my family did, and soon they would be sharing that perspective in a way that would make any further skepticism about my success look absolutely ridiculous. But in the meantime, I continued to navigate the strange reality of being incredibly successful in my professional life, while being completely misunderstood by the people who should have known me best. It was a lonely way to live, but it was also teaching me valuable lessons about the difference between external validation and internal confidence. I was about to learn that sometimes the most powerful vindication comes from the most unexpected source, and sometimes the people who doubt you the most are the ones who are most shocked when the full truth finally comes to light. The crisis began with what should have been the most triumphant moment of my entrepreneurial career. It was October, and I had just received a formal acquisition offer from Tech Global Industries, one of the largest enterprise software companies in the world. The offer was for $475 million, with the potential for additional performance bonuses that could push the total value over $500 million. The negotiations had been ongoing for 3 months, involving teams of lawyers, accountants, and executives from both companies. The due diligence process had been exhaustive, requiring me to open every aspect of Pinnacle Digital Solutions to scrutinize financial records, customer contracts, employee agreements, intellectual property documentation, compliance reports. Everything had been analyzed and verified by independent auditors. The final offer came with a personal employment contract that would make me the Chief Innovation Officer of Tech Global's Small Business Solutions division, with a guaranteed salary of $2.8 million annually, plus equity participation in the combined entity. It was the kind of life-changing opportunity that validated every risk I'd taken and every sacrifice I'd made over the past 6 years. But instead of celebrating with family, I found myself sitting alone in my home office, staring at the acquisition documents, and feeling profoundly isolated. The people who should have been most excited about this incredible outcome were the same people who had spent years telling me I was chasing an impossible dream. I had learned to live with their skepticism, but this moment made me realize how much their constant doubt had cost me emotionally. I was about to become a wealthy woman by any measure, and I had no one to share that joy with who had been there during the struggling years. The mentors and colleagues who understood the significance of the offer were wonderful, but they hadn't known me when I was eating ramen noodles and coding 18 hours a day. The decision to accept the offer was both obvious and terrifying. Obviously, because the financial terms were beyond anything I could have imagined when I started the company. Terrifying because it meant giving up control of something I'd built from nothing, and trusting Tech Global to continue the mission that had driven me for so many years. After extensive discussions with my advisory board and legal team, I decided to move forward with the acquisition. The paperwork was complex, involving multiple corporate entities, international tax considerations, and regulatory approvals that would take several months to complete. But the handshake agreement was in place, and I was officially committed to selling Pinnacle Digital Solutions for nearly $500 million. The announcement was scheduled for early December, which meant I had about 6 weeks to prepare for a level of public attention that I'd never experienced before. The communications team at Tech Global warned me that a deal of this size would attract significant media coverage, including features in major business publications and probably some interest from mainstream news outlets. They were particularly concerned about maintaining confidentiality until the official announcement. Any premature disclosure could complicate the regulatory approval process or create problems with the stock market reaction to Tech Global's major acquisition. I was advised to avoid discussing the deal with anyone outside the immediate transaction team, which meant continuing to keep my family in the dark about the magnitude of what was happening. This secrecy requirement created an even wider gap between my public success and my family's awareness of it. During our monthly phone calls, I had to deflect questions about how business was going while sitting in my office surrounded by acquisition documents that represented more money than most people see in multiple lifetimes. The situation became almost surreal during our family's Thanksgiving gathering. I had initially planned to skip the event, citing work commitments that my family probably assumed were another example of my taking my little company too serious. But my mother called 2 weeks before the holiday, practically in tears, begging me to come home. "It's been almost a year since we've all been together," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know you're busy with work, but family has to come first sometime. Vanessa has been asking about you, and I think she really wants to reconnect. Please, Natalie, it would mean the world to me if you could just set aside whatever differences you have and spend the holiday with us." The conversation left me feeling guilty and conflicted. Part of me wanted to maintain the distance I'd created, to protect myself from more skepticism and condescension. But another part of me missed the family connections that had once been important to me despite all the complications. I also had to admit that I was curious about how the dynamic would play out now that I was literally weeks away from becoming one of the wealthiest self-made women in the Pacific Northwest. Would they sense that something had changed, even without knowing the specifics? Would their treatment of me be different if they picked up on subtle signs of my dramatically improved circumstances? I decided to attend the Thanksgiving gathering, but I was determined to keep my guard up. I wouldn't share any details about the acquisition, and I wouldn't rise to any bait if Vanessa decided to make comments about my career choices. I would be polite, pleasant, and completely unrevealing about the biggest professional achievement of my life. The drive from Seattle to Cedar Falls gave me 3 hours to prepare mentally for what I knew would be a challenging few days.
I had rented a luxury SUV for the trip, partly because my Tesla would have been too obvious a sign of prosperity, and partly because I wanted the psychological comfort of being surrounded by something beautiful and expensive, while dealing with family stress. The house looked exactly the same as it had during my childhood, a modest but well-maintained ranch-style home in a neighborhood of similar properties. My parents had lived there for 35 years, raising 2 daughters and building a comfortable middle-class life that represented everything they valued about stability and conventional success. Walking up the familiar driveway, carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month, I felt like I was entering a parallel universe where none of my professional achievements existed. In this house, I would always be the younger daughter who had made questionable life choices and needed guidance from her more practical older sister. The evening started pleasantly enough. Mom had prepared all my favorite dishes, and Dad was in an unusually talkative mood, sharing stories about recent changes at his job and asking about my drive from Seattle. Vanessa arrived about an hour after me, looking polished and confident in the way that it always made me feel slightly inadequate when we were younger. She greeted me with what seemed like genuine warmth, asking about my health and commenting on how good I looked. For a brief moment, I wondered if maybe the distance between us had allowed some of the old tensions to fade. Maybe we could have a normal family gathering without the undercurrent of professional rivalry that had poisoned so many previous interactions. That hope lasted until we sat down for dinner and the conversation turned to work. Dad mentioned that Vanessa had recently been promoted to senior marketing director at her insurance company, achievement that clearly made both our parents very proud. She's overseeing campaigns for 3 different product lines now, Mom said, beaming at Vanessa with the kind of obvious pride that I hadn't seen directed toward me in years. And her team has grown to 12 people. The company is really recognizing her leadership potential. Vanessa accepted the praise graciously, but then immediately turned the conversation toward me. What about you, Natalie? How's your business doing? Are you still working with those small restaurant and retail clients? The question seemed innocent enough, but I could hear the subtle condescension in her tone. She was framing my work in the same terms she'd been using for years, as if I was still a freelancer serving a handful of local businesses, rather than the founder of a company that was about to be acquired for nearly $500 million. Business is good, I replied carefully. We've expanded quite a bit over the past year. More clients, more employees, more complex projects. That's wonderful, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I've been reading about how challenging it is for small software companies to scale up. There are so many moving parts, managing cash flow, hiring the right people, keeping up with technology changes. It must be incredibly stressful trying to stay competitive. There it was, the familiar pattern of seeming support wrapped around subtle undermining. She was positioning herself as someone who understood business challenges, while implying that I was probably struggling with problems that were beyond my experience level. Every business has its challenges, I said neutrally, taking a sip of wine and wondering how I was going to get through the rest of the evening without either losing my temper or revealing information I wasn't supposed to share. Of course, Vanessa continued, but I imagine it's especially difficult when you're trying to compete against established companies with much larger budgets and more resources. Have you thought about maybe positioning yourself as a niche provider rather than trying to compete directly with the major players? The irony was almost overwhelming. Here she was, giving me strategic advice about competing with major players, while I was literally in the process of being acquired by one of the biggest companies in the industry. But I couldn't say anything about the acquisition, so I had to sit there and listen to her explain how I should approach problems I'd already solved. That's certainly something to consider, I said, hoping my voice didn't betray my frustration. Dad jumped in with his own perspective on the challenges of running a small business. The key is to find your niche and stick to it, he said, using the tone of someone passing along hard-earned wisdom. Don't try to be everything to everyone. Build a solid reputation in one area, and then maybe you can expand gradually. His advice would have been excellent for someone just starting out, but it was completely irrelevant to my situation. Pinnacle Digital Solutions had already expanded into multiple market segments and had established itself as a leader in several different areas. We weren't looking for a niche, we were defining the market. Dad's right, Vanessa agreed. And don't feel like you have to grow too fast. Sustainable growth is much more important than rapid expansion that might not be profitable. I see a lot of companies get into trouble because they tried to scale before they were really ready. The conversation continued in this vein for most of the meal, with Vanessa and my parents offering advice that would have been appropriate for someone running a small consulting practice rather than someone who had built a major technology company. Every suggestion was well-intentioned, but completely disconnected from my actual circumstances. What made it even more difficult was that I couldn't defend myself without revealing information about the acquisition. I had to sit there and accept their guidance gracefully, nodding and thanking them for their concern, while internally screaming about how wrong they were about everything. The breaking point came during dessert, when Vanessa started talking about the importance of having realistic expectations about entrepreneurial success. I think one of the challenges for people in Natalie's situation, she said, speaking about me as if I wasn't sitting right there, is that they hear about these incredible success stories, companies that get bought for millions of dollars or founders who become millionaires overnight, and they start to think that's the normal outcome for startups. She took a bite of pie and continued her lecture. But the reality is that most small businesses never get beyond a certain size. They provide a decent living for the founder, maybe support a few employees, but they don't become the next Google or Facebook. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with building a modest, sustainable business that pays the bills and gives you flexibility. Her words felt like physical blows. She was literally describing my company as the kind of modest operation that would never amount to anything significant, while I was sitting on acquisition documents that proved exactly the opposite. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. I think the important thing, she continued, getting warmed up to her theme, is to have realistic goals and not get caught up in fantasies about becoming the next tech billionaire. Success comes in many forms, and sometimes the most successful entrepreneurs are the ones who build steady, reliable businesses, rather than chasing after the impossible dream of explosive growth. My parents were nodding along with this wisdom, clearly thinking that Vanessa was helping me understand important truths about the business world. They probably thought this conversation was exactly what I needed to hear, practical guidance from someone who understood how the real world worked. I wanted to laugh or cry or stand up and scream that she had no idea what she was talking about. Instead, I smiled and nodded and thanked her for the perspective, feeling like I was trapped in some kind of surreal performance where I had to pretend that fiction was reality. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and growing internal tension. I helped with dishes, watched football with Dad, and made small talk with relatives who called to check in. Through it all, I felt like I was wearing a mask, playing a role that bore no resemblance to who I actually was or what I'd actually accomplished. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom and staring at the ceiling, I made a decision that felt both liberating and final. I was done protecting their feelings by hiding my success. When the acquisition was announced in a few weeks, I wouldn't try to minimize it or explain it away. I would let them discover the truth along with everyone else, and I would let them deal with the shock of learning how completely wrong they'd been about everything. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but it also felt like the only way to preserve my sanity. I couldn't continue living a double life, pretending to be someone I wasn't in order to maintain relationships that were based on fundamental mental understandings about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. Little did I know that the universe was about to take the decision out of my hands entirely. Within 2 weeks of that Thanksgiving dinner, I would receive a phone call that would force every detail of my financial situation into the open, whether I was ready for that revelation or not. The IRS, as it turned out, had some very specific questions about my tax obligations related to the acquisition, and those questions would lead to a conversation that would make it impossible for anyone to continue believing that I was running a modest little technology company that might someday grow into something significant. The reckoning was coming, and it would be more dramatic than anything I could have planned or orchestrated myself. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in early December, just as I was reviewing the final legal documents for the Tech Global acquisition. I was in my office, surrounded by contracts and financial statements that represented the culmination of everything I'd worked toward for the past 6 years. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about the formal tone of the woman's voice immediately got my attention. Ms. Brooks, this is Agent Linda Thompson, from the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. I need to schedule a meeting with you regarding your recent tax filings and some questions we have about your reported income and business transactions. My blood ran cold. The words Criminal Investigation Division echoed in my mind as I tried to process what was happening. I had always been meticulous about my taxes, working with top-tier accountants, and ensuring that every dollar was properly documented and reported. The idea that there might be some kind of criminal investigation involving my finances was terrifying and completely bewildering. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I managed to say, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. Did you say criminal investigation? Agent Thompson's tone was professional but not unkind. Yes, ma'am. We're conducting a review of certain high-income taxpayers to verify compliance with federal tax obligations. Your name came up in our system due to the significant increase in your reported income over the past 2 years, particularly regarding the capital gains implications of your pending business transaction. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. They weren't investigating me for wrongdoing, they were investigating me for making too much money too quickly. In the federal government's eyes, my success had been so dramatic that it triggered automatic reviews to ensure I wasn't evading my tax obligation. I understand, I said, feeling my heart rate begin to return to normal. When would you like to meet? I can have my accountant and attorney present. That would be advisable, Agent Thompson replied. How about Thursday at 10 a.m. at our Seattle office? And Ms. Brooks, please bring all documentation related to your business income, the pending acquisition, and any other significant financial transactions from the past 3 years. This is a comprehensive review. After hanging up, I immediately called my attorney and my accountant to brief them on the situation. Both assured me that this type of review was actually a positive sign. The IRS only conducted such thorough investigations on individuals whose financial success was significant enough to warrant careful verification. They want to make sure you're paying your fair share on what appears to be a very large amount of income, my attorney explained. It's actually a compliment, in a strange way. You've made so much money that you've attracted the attention of the federal government. The irony wasn't lost on me. My family had spent years treating my business as a cute hobby that might someday amount to something meaningful, while the United States government was launching a formal investigation into my finances because my income was too high to ignore. Thursday morning arrived with an early December rainstorm that seemed to match my nervous energy. I dressed carefully in my most conservative business suit and gathered every piece of financial documentation I could think of. The files filled 2 large briefcases and included everything from my original business registration paperwork to the latest acquisition contracts with Tech Global. The IRS office was exactly what you'd expect: beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and an atmosphere of bureaucratic efficiency that somehow managed to be both intimidating and mundane. Agent Thompson turned out to be a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every type of financial scheme imaginable. She was joined by Agent Marcus Rodriguez, a younger man who appeared to be taking detailed notes on everything that was said. My attorney David Chen, no relation to my business partner Marcus, sat beside me, while my accountant Sarah Williams had brought her own stack of meticulously organized tax documents. Ms. Brooks, Agent Thompson began, opening a thick file that had my name on the tab. Let's start with a simple question. Can you walk me through the evolution of your business income over the past 5 years? We're particularly interested in understanding how your reported income increased from approximately $68,000 in your final year of traditional employment to the figures we're seeing now. The question was straightforward, but answering it meant telling a story that would have blown my family's minds if they'd been there to hear it. I began with the basics, leaving my job, starting Pinnacle Digital Solutions, the early struggles with funding and customer acquisition. In the first year, I explained, I reported a loss of about $42,000, which was primarily my living expenses and initial development costs. The second year, I had revenue of approximately $180,000, but after business expenses and reinvestment, my personal income was only about $35,000. Agent Rodriguez was taking notes furiously as I continued. Year 3 was when things really started to accelerate. Revenue hit $850,000, and I paid myself a salary of $120,000 plus took some distributions that brought my total income to about $210,000. And last year, Agent Thompson prompted, last year business revenue was $4.2 million. After all expenses and taxes, I reported personal income of approximately $1.8 million. The numbers hung in the air like physical objects. Even saying them out loud felt surreal. Just a few years earlier, I'd been living on ramen noodles and worrying about making rent. Now I was sitting in a federal office, explaining to IRS agents why my income had increased by more than 5,000% in the span of a few years. And this year, Agent Thompson asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I glanced at my attorney, who nodded for me to continue. This year is more complicated because of the acquisition. My salary and distributions from the business total about $2.4 million, but the sale of the company will result in capital gains of approximately $475 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Agent Rodriguez stopped writing and looked up from his note. Agent Thompson leaned back in her chair and studied me with the expression of someone trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. Ms. Brooks, she said finally, I need to make sure I understand this correctly. You're telling me that in the span of 6 years, you went from being unemployed to earning nearly $500 million from the sale of a company you built yourself? That's correct, I replied, feeling oddly calm despite the magnitude of what we were discussing. And you're confident that all of this income has been properly reported and that the appropriate taxes will be paid? My accountant jumped in to answer this question. Absolutely. We've been working with tax specialists from the beginning to ensure compliance with all federal and state requirements. The acquisition is structured to minimize tax implications where legally possible, but Ms. Brooks will still owe approximately $190 million in combined federal and state taxes on the transaction. $190 million in taxes. The number was so large it almost lost meaning. I was going to pay more in taxes on this single transaction than most people would earn in multiple lifetimes. It was more than the annual budget of many small cities. Agent Thompson made some notes in her file, and then looked at me with what might have been respect. Ms. Brooks, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I can honestly say that your case is one of the most remarkable examples of legitimate wealth creation I've encountered. The documentation you've provided supports everything you've told us, and it's clear that you've been working with qualified professionals to ensure compliance. She closed the file and leaned forward. However, given the magnitude of this transaction, we're going to need to conduct a more thorough audit. This isn't because we suspect any wrongdoing, it's because taxpayers at your income level are subject to additional scrutiny as a matter of policy. We'll need to verify every major transaction, review your business relationships, and confirm that the acquisition price is legitimate. The audit process, she explained, would take approximately 6 to 8 weeks and would involve multiple agents reviewing different aspects of my financial history. They would interview key employees at Pinnacle Digital Solutions, speak with major customers and partners, and coordinate with Tech Global's compliance team to verify the acquisition detail. We'll also need to contact your family members to confirm certain personal information and ensure that there haven't been any unreported transfers of assets or income. Agent Thompson added casually. My heart stopped. You're going to contact my family. It's standard procedure for audits of this magnitude, Agent Rodriguez explained. We need to verify that you haven't been using family members to hide income or assets. We'll speak with your parents and any siblings to confirm their understanding of your financial situation and business activities. I felt the blood drain from my face as I imagined that conversation. Agent Thompson calling my parents to ask about my business income. Agent Rodriguez interviewing Vanessa about her knowledge of my financial situation. The thought of federal agents explaining to my family that they were investigating me because I'd made too much money was both terrifying and oddly satisfying.
Is there any way to exclude family members from the audit? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I'm afraid not, Agent Thompson replied. Family interviews are mandatory for audits involving transactions over $100 million. We'll be contacting them within the next 2 weeks. The meeting concluded with instructions about additional documentation I would need to provide and a timeline for the audit process. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Agent Thompson made one final comment that would stick with me for days. Brooks, I want you to know that cases like yours are why I enjoy this job. It's refreshing to investigate someone whose only crime is being extraordinarily successful through legitimate business activities. Your tax payment on this transaction will fund federal programs for months. You should be proud of what you've accomplished. Walking out of the IRS office into the December rain, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation that was impossible to describe. The audit would be stressful and time-consuming, but it would also serve as the ultimate validation of everything I'd built. When federal agents finished their investigation, there would be no question about the legitimacy and magnitude of my success. More importantly, my family was about to receive the shock of their lives. Within 2 weeks, Agent Thompson or one of her colleagues would be calling my parents and Vanessa to ask about their knowledge of my business activities and financial situation. They would learn, through official federal channels, that their assumptions about my little technology company had been not just wrong, but spectacularly embarrassingly wrong. I spent the drive back to my office imagining those conversations. Agent Thompson explaining to my mother that they needed to verify information about my income, because I was paying nearly $200 million in tax. Agent Rodriguez asking Vanessa about her understanding of my business success, because the federal government needed to confirm that I hadn't been hiding assets worth $500 million. The thought of their reactions was both thrilling and terrifying. Part of me had always wanted them to understand what I'd really accomplished, to see that their skepticism had been misplaced and their advice irrelevant. But another part of me was afraid of how the revelation would change our family dynamic forever. There would be no going back after this. Once they learned the truth about my financial situation, every interaction we'd ever had about my career would be recontextualized. Every piece of advice they'd given me, every expression of concern about my choices, every suggestion that I should be more realistic about my prospects, all of it would be revealed as coming from people who had fundamentally misunderstood what I was capable of achieving. That evening, I sat in my home office and stared at the Seattle skyline, thinking about how dramatically my life was about to change. The acquisition would make me wealthy beyond my wildest dreams, but the IRS audit would do something even more significant. It would force my family to confront the reality of who I'd become and what I'd accomplished. I thought about calling them to prepare them for the agent's contact, but I decided against it. They had spent years dismissing my success and minimizing my achievement. Let them learn the truth the same way they'd learned everything else about my business after the fact, from outside sources, with no input or involvement from me. The federal government was about to do what I'd never been able to accomplish myself. They were going to make my family understand once and for all that the little sister they'd been patronizing and advising was actually one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the region. The irony was perfect. The same skepticism that had driven me to stop sharing information about my business was about to ensure that they learned about my success in the most dramatic and undeniable way possible. There would be no room for doubt, no way to minimize the achievement, no opportunity to suggest that the numbers were inflated or the success temporary.
The United States government doesn't audit people who aren't making extraordinary amounts of money. When Agent Thompson called my family, there would be no ambiguity about what that phone call meant. Their little sister, the one who'd made such questionable choices about her career, had become successful enough to warrant federal investigation. I found myself looking forward to their reactions with a mixture of anticipation and dread. After years of feeling like I was invisible to them, I was about to become impossible to ignore. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 12 days after my meeting with Agent Thompson. I was in the middle of a video conference with Tech Global's integration team when my assistant knocked on my office door with an expression that suggested something urgent was happening. "Your mother is online too," she whispered. "She sounds upset." I excused myself from the meeting and picked up the phone, immediately hearing my mother's voice in a state I'd rarely experienced. Complete bewilderment mixed with what sounded like panic. "Natalie, I just got off the phone with someone from the IRS," she said without any preamble. "They said they needed to ask me questions about your business and your income. I don't understand what's happening. Are you in some kind of trouble? Did something go wrong with your company?" The moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading had finally arrived. I could hear the genuine fear in her voice, the assumption that a call from federal agents must mean something terrible had happened. It probably hadn't occurred to her that the IRS might be calling because I'd been too successful rather than because I'd done something wrong. "Mom, I'm not in trouble," I said gently. "The IRS is conducting an audit because of the size of a business transaction I'm involved in. It's actually a good thing. It means they're verifying that everything is legitimate." "But the agent said something about $500 million," she continued, her voice rising. "I told her there must be some mistake, that you run a small software company." She said she couldn't discuss details with me, but that she needed to confirm whether I had any knowledge of your business income or assets. "Natalie, what is she talking about?" I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. This was it. The moment when 6 years of family skepticism was about to collide with the reality of what I'd actually accomplished. There was no way to ease into this revelation gently. "Mom, I need you to sit down," I said. The agent was right. "I'm selling my company for $475 million. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, I heard my mother's voice, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" "My company, Pinnacle Digital Solutions, is being acquired by Tech Global Industries for $475 million. The IRS is auditing me because the transaction is large enough to trigger automatic federal review. I'm going to pay almost $200 million in tax." Another long silence, followed by what sounded like my mother setting the phone down and calling for my father. I could hear muffled conversation in the background, then my father's voice on the line. "Natalie, your mother says something about your company being sold for hundreds of millions of dollars. That can't be right." "It is right, Dad. I've been trying to tell you all for years that the business was growing, but every time I mentioned progress, Vanessa would explain why the numbers weren't as impressive as they seemed, so I stopped sharing details." But you said it was software for small businesses," he stammered. "How does that become worth $500 million? I spent the next 20 minutes explaining what Pinnacle Digital Solutions had actually become, the client base that spanned multiple industries and 49 states, the employee count that had grown to over 200 people, the revenue that had reached 8 figures annually. I told them about the partnerships with major corporations, the international expansion, the technology innovations that had revolutionized how businesses manage their operations. With every detail I shared, the silence on their end became more profound. These weren't the metrics of a small startup struggling to find its footing. These were the numbers of a major technology company that had become a leader in its field. "Why didn't you tell us?" my mother finally asked, her voice thick with emotion that I couldn't quite identify. "I tried to," I replied, feeling years of frustration bubbling to the surface. But every time I shared good news, it was dismissed or minimized. When I mentioned major contracts, Vanessa would explain why they weren't sustainable. When I talked about hiring employees, you'd worry about my overhead costs. When I celebrated growth milestones, the response was always caution about getting ahead of myself. "But Natalie," my father interjected, "we were just trying to help you stay realistic. We didn't want you to get disappointed if things didn't work out." "Things did work out, Dad. They worked out beyond anything I could have imagined when I started. But instead of celebrating that success with me, you spent years treating me like I was chasing an impossible dream." The conversation continued for another hour, with my parents asking questions that revealed just how completely they'd misunderstood my situation. They genuinely believed I was running a small operation that might someday become moderately successful. The idea that I'd built something worth hundreds of millions of dollars was so far outside their frame of reference that they were struggling to process it. The IRS agent wants to interview me again next week, my mother said as the call was winding down. She said she needs to verify that I don't have any knowledge of undisclosed assets or income transfers. What should I tell her? Tell her the truth, I replied. That you had no idea about the scale of my business success because I stopped sharing details after years of having them questioned and dismissed. The call with my parents was emotionally draining, but I knew it was only the beginning. Agent Thompson had mentioned that she would be contacting all immediate family members, which meant Vanessa was going to receive her own phone call soon. That call came 2 days later, and the aftermath was even more dramatic than I'd anticipated. Vanessa called me at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning, and I could tell from her first words that the conversation with the federal agent had shattered every assumption she'd been making about my life for the past 6 years. I just spent an hour on the phone with an IRS agent who told me that you're paying more in taxes than most people make in their entire lives, she said without any greeting. She asked me about my knowledge of your business operations and whether I was aware of any financial transactions involving hundreds of millions of dollars. I told her she must have the wrong person, that my sister runs a small software company. And what did she say to that? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She said that according to their records, your small software company processed over $60 million in revenue last year and is being sold for an amount that puts you among the wealthiest self-made women in Washington state. The phrase hung between us like a challenge. Vanessa had spent years positioning herself as the successful sister, the one who'd made smart career choices and achieved financial stability. Now she was learning that while she'd been earning a comfortable salary at an insurance company, her little sister had been building a business empire. I don't understand how this is possible, she continued, her voice carrying a mixture of confusion and something that might have been anger. If your company was really worth this much money, why were you living in that tiny apartment? Why were you always worried about expenses? Why didn't you act like someone who was successful? Because I wasn't successful yet, I explained patiently. Building a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars takes time. For the first few years, I was reinvesting everything back into growth. I was living modestly because I was prioritizing the business over personal expenses. But you never told us how big it was getting. I tried, but every time I shared progress updates, you would explain why the numbers weren't as impressive as they seemed. You told me I was being unrealistic about market opportunity. You suggested I should focus on building a modest, sustainable business instead of chasing fantasies about explosive growth. So I stopped trying to convince you. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. For the first time in our adult lives, Vanessa was the one asking questions while I provided perspective about business strategy and market dynamics. The dynamic had completely reversed suddenly. I was the sister with valuable insights about entrepreneurship and financial success. The IRS agent said you're going to pay almost $200 million in taxes, Vanessa said, her voice barely audible. That's more than I'll earn in my entire career, even if I get promoted every few years. The comment revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated before. Vanessa's skepticism about my business hadn't just been about protecting me from disappointment. It had been about protecting herself from the possibility that her younger sister might surpass her professionally. As long as she could frame my entrepreneurship as impractical dreaming, she could maintain her position as the responsible, successful daughter. Now that framing had been completely destroyed by federal agents who don't investigate people unless they're making extraordinary amounts of money, there was no way to minimize or dismiss success that had attracted the attention of the United States government. I keep thinking about all the times I gave you advice about being realistic, she said after a long pause. All the times I suggested you should consider more traditional career path. I was so confident that I understood business better than you did. You understood traditional business, I replied, trying to be generous despite years of frustration. But I was building something that didn't fit traditional model. The tech industry operates differently. Growth patterns are exponential rather than linear. Market opportunities can emerge overnight, and success often looks impossible until suddenly it's undeniable. The revelation transformed our family dynamic immediately and permanently. Within a week of the IRS calls, I received messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, all congratulating me on my success and expressing amazement that they'd known a future multimillionaire without realizing it. My parents' attitude shifted completely. The worried questions about financial stability were replaced by requests for advice about their own retirement planning. They started introducing me to their friends as our daughter, the entrepreneur with obvious pride that felt strange after years of subtle disappointment. Vanessa's transformation was the most dramatic. The sister who had spent years explaining why my business prospects were limited suddenly wanted to understand every aspect of how I'd built such a successful company. She asked detailed questions about market research, customer acquisition, scaling strategies, and exit planning. It was as if she was trying to reverse engineer my success to understand how she'd misread the situation so completely. The acquisition closed in February, making the financial transformation official. The wire transfer that deposited $475 million into my accounts was surreal, watching numbers appear on a screen that represented more money than most small countries generate in a year. But the emotional transformation had already happened months earlier during those phone calls when my family learned that the federal government considered my success significant enough to investigate. That was the moment when years of skepticism and minimization finally gave way to recognition and respect. The most satisfying part wasn't the money itself, it was the vindication. Every doubt that had been expressed, every piece of advice about being more realistic, every suggestion that I should consider safer alternatives had been proven wrong in the most dramatic way possible. The IRS doesn't audit people for building modest, sustainable business. They audit people who make so much money that the government needs to verify it's legitimate. Today, as I write this from my home office, overlooking Elliott Bay, I'm still processing the magnitude of how much my life has changed. The financial freedom is incredible, but the family reconciliation has been equally valuable. My parents and I talk regularly about business opportunities and investment strategies. Vanessa and I have developed a relationship based on mutual respect rather than skeptical concern. The distance I created to protect myself from their doubt ultimately made the revelation more powerful. When federal agents called to verify my income, there was no room for misinterpretation or minimization. The skeptics who had spent years questioning my judgment were suddenly faced with evidence that I'd been right about everything they'd told me was impossible. Sometimes the most powerful validation comes from the most unexpected source. I'd spent years craving my family's recognition of my success, never imagining that it would ultimately come through a phone call from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The young woman who left her stable job to chase an impossible dream had become successful enough to warrant federal investigation, and sometimes that's the most satisfying kind of vindication you can ask for. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.